Recorded live from Hong Kong and Toronto. Let's go! This is the PR and Law Podcast.
The PR and Law Podcast.
Turn it up. With your hosts, Cam McMurchie and Ewan Christie.
Welcome to episode 32 of the PR and Law Podcast. I'm your host, Cam McMurchie, with Ewan Christie.
Hello, Cameron.
Ewan is an employment lawyer and partner at Duntroon LLP in Toronto, Canada, and online at duntroon.law. I'm a PR guy based in Hong Kong and publisher of the Digital Bits PR and Communications newsletter at digitalbitspr.com. If you enjoy the podcast, please tell a friend. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and subscribe to us on YouTube and SoundCloud. But most important of all, please sign up for our newsletter. You can get updates when new episodes drop and other show information at prlawpodcast.club. We have a very big show planned today, along with a special guest in our green room ready to join us shortly to talk all things PR. But first, Ewan, what's happening on your side?
Whoa, I didn't even know we have a green room. That's exciting.
I think our guest probably doesn't know either.
Oh, well, I'm hanging out down in the basement today. We've got 110 kilometer an hour winds here in Toronto, so I hope you can hear me all right. I hope I don't blow away.
You're not going to be happy to hear this, Ewan, because you know we're recording today again on Monday morning Hong Kong time, Sunday evening your time, and it is a beautiful blue sky day here with a high of 24 degrees. It's perfect.
Yeah, that really doesn't make me feel any better, Cam. Not in the least. Not in the least. Although I should say I have power, and as I understand, people to the north, east, south, and west of me are all without. So apparently, I'm lucky.
Yeah, that's always an issue. Yeah, with the power lines sort of above ground, because that's the other thing different with Asia. A lot of the power is underground, and so when we get the typhoons, the power stays on, which is quite good. But that's one of the challenges of living in a massive country that you get there, and you get many benefits from that too. On the flip side.
This is true.
Yeah. I wanted to bring up one thing today, Ewan, because, we talk about the power of communications and the power of sort of who is saying and what they're saying, what their message is, and who is delivering the message, and how, that can really shape views. So I was really caught yesterday when I came across this video, which was shared on Instagram and Twitter as well. And it's about Donald Trump. Sort of. I'm not sure if you recall, but the Trump campaign, a few days after the election, decided to hold a news conference at the Four Seasons in Philadelphia. The president said that they would go to the Four Seasons to sort of make their case to challenge the election results. And that Four Seasons turned out to be a Four Seasons total landscaping, not the Four Seasons hotel. And it's described as a ramshackle industrial zone parking lot near an exit in Philadelphia. And this story is quite funny, Ewan, so I'm going to put a link in the show notes. But the main point is, Trump's people were there, including, Rudy Giuliani and people like that, along with another man named Corey Lewandowski. Does that name ring a bell to you, Ewan?
Yeah, of course it does. Yeah.
He was Trump's campaign manager in 2016 before he was fired, and that's when Steve Bannon took over. But he has he's been a CNN pundit over the years, that kind of thing, and he's stayed involved with the Trump campaign. Anyway, it's Corey Lewandowski's wife who posted the video, and here's what she had to say.
Hey, y'all. I'm sure you've heard by now that my husband, Corey, has been diagnosed with COVID-19. I'm sorry. I was going to try to pretend to cry, but I can't even do that, y'all. Y'all know this is going to happen. Like, I knew it was going to happen. I've been telling him, like, it's going to happen. And he's been like, well, you don't know what you're talking about. You're stupid. You're a woman, And I'm like, you always say that. But I always told him, like, God always gets those who need to get got. And he's one of those that needed to get got. And today the Lord has blessed us because today Corey has COVID-19. And I mean, y'all, it was so validating to see, because I swear to God, I turned on my TV last Sunday and I saw that motherfucker. I saw the father of my children at Four Seasons Total Landscaping standing there like a fucking nerd with Rudy Giuliani and all those other dipshits, pretending like he's not fully involved in Hope Hicks' ass. And I saw him and he looked so stupid. And I sent him a text and I was like, you're going to get COVID. Well, I did it with emojis. So it was like the plain white man emoji, an arrow, the COVID emoji, the mask emoji, the X emoji, and then me and the kids leaving emoji. And he sent me a text back and he was like, Ducky, you don't know what you're talking about. But lo and behold, here we are. Listen, may the Lord bless you.
Sounds like a happy marriage.
Well, hey, Cam, you might be the communications guy, but I think that Corey Lewandowski's wife is the one who's dropping bombs there. God always gets those who need to get got. Somebody should put that on a bumper sticker. That's amazing.
Yes. You know, when I listened to this, and I just thought this is sort of a worst nightmare for people because, you know, if you professionally criticize somebody, there's still sort of an arm's length between who the person is and what they do. Not always, but sometimes. But this is an example of the closest person, theoretically, to Lewandowski. The person, it's the mother of his children. It's the person who knows him best to talk this way about him publicly. I mean, it's one thing to say this privately to her friends, another to put it out there publicly. It's just the strongest indictment of Lewandowski you could possibly have. And again, this isn't a company PR. This is not some sort of, company initiative. It's just one person speaking to Instagram by herself. But the power behind that, just because of the context, is quite incredible.
Now, Cam, just a quick point, because, we often talk about on this show how particular messages are mischaracterized or misreported in the news. My understanding, and I saw a news report, and maybe this news report was mischaracterizing what actually happened, but that the intention was, in fact, to hold the press conference at the Four Seasons Total Landscaping, and that this was largely determined because of its proximity to highways in terms of being able to get people in and out, and that it was largely the media that picked it up and concocted this story that the intention was to have it at a Four Seasons hotel, and Trump's incompetent communications people effectively just put out the wrong or booked the wrong event. Is that not right?
That is one version that's floating around. I'll post a couple of articles in the show notes. It's not clear what happened. I would suspect that this is not on purpose, only because it looked, as a backdrop, it looked awful. If you're the president of the United States and you're challenging an election, so it would seem very odd to do that in a strip mall in front of a really rundown building. But also, how did that happen? Like, how did it end up there? I mean, there's some people are speculating that Trump said publicly it would be at the Four Seasons, but the Four Seasons Philadelphia was booked out. And so they had to find a way to make what Trump said true. That's one version that came out. I don't think that one sounds right to me either. But I don't think we're ever going to know, Ewan, because it's just one of those things that's it's going to be an election mystery.
Continue the debate with us on social media. Join us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at PR Law Podcast. All one word, PRLAW Podcast. Send us your questions now by email to askus@prlawpodcast.com. That's all one word, askus@prlawpodcast.com, or on social media with the hashtag PRLawPod. That's hashtag PRLAWPOD.
All right, we're really happy this week because we do have a very special guest joining us today. It's Simon Murphy. He's the head of corporate at Edelman. I think our PR and communications listeners are probably familiar with that brand name, Edelman. But for those of you who aren't, Edelman's one of the largest, if not the largest, PR and communications firms in the world. So it's a treat to have Simon join us today. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Cam. Hey, Ewan. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Before we get started, maybe you can just sort of give us a bit of bit of background on yourself and sort of what you do at Edelman.
Yeah, sure. So as you rightly called out, I'm the head of corporate at Edelman in Hong Kong. Edelman is the world's largest independent communications firm. So there's about 6,000 of us around the world. And typically we work with well-known and less well-known brands and companies who either want to promote or else protect their brand reputation. And we do that by earning trust. Trust is the currency which helps protect those firms and wins loyal advocates out there.
Yeah, that's another thing that we have talked a lot about on the show is trust and how important that is for companies that are trying to communicate. I've worked with Simon a little bit in my current role, and obviously one of the big issues has been this year, and even prior to that, is the U.S. election, which was held earlier this month. And I mean, it is just a U.S. presidential election, but it seems to have impact that goes far and wide beyond the United States. Sort of what was your impression on this election cycle, Simon, in terms of sort of how companies outside of the U.S. were preparing? Sort of what questions did they have, or what did they seem to be concerned about?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. It happened in the US, Cam, of course, but I think in living memory, it's probably one of the most globally anticipated elections. And a week and a half after the event, we still don't really know the outcome. And that really reflects the uncertainty that this has caused, not just for firms operating within the US and international firms dealing with the rest of the world, but also other regions as well. So in terms of my clients, there's been a lot of eager anticipation, but also defensiveness. The geopolitics between the US and China, of course, has been rife in the recent months. And this has a real impact, not just on the Asia region, but the world in general. So uncertainty, I think, is probably the word that underscores the US election and continues to do so.
Right. And in particular, Chinese companies as well seem to be sort of a target of this administration.
Yeah, no, it appears so. And I think with Trump almost conceding defeat by his favorite medium, Twitter, or has he? We'll see as various law cases proceed. But yeah, it certainly seems that one of the accusations he's making is that China helped him lose the election because that's where COVID started.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And what Simon's referring to is the president seemed to indicate potentially that Joe Biden did win the election, but then he quickly reneged and said it was rigged and he's not going to concede anything in typical Trumpian style.
In capital letters, so it must be true.
Exactly. He loves to do that. We talk on this show a lot about how companies need to focus on PR, that it's not just an afterthought or an admin kind of function, but something that sort of requires investment, because bad PR can be very severe. Obviously, it could put companies out of business even. So what are some changes to the industry that you've seen sort of over your career? Because you're quite experienced sort of in this field. How has it evolved, and how have sort of your clients changed over time?
Well, yeah. I mean, I started my career working very much with brands who are wanting to promote themselves in, I guess, the traditional PR sense of getting exposure within the traditional media. And back then, of course, 25 odd years ago, the traditional media was pretty strong. People read newspapers. These days, they don't. And so that storytelling has evolved. We now talk to multiple different stakeholders, not just the media, but government, influencers, industry, and employees are a really important audience as well. And we do so through multiple channels. So it's no longer just the traditional media. So that's the kind of nature of the storytelling, how that's evolved. But also the industry itself has become a lot more consultative. We're there to help tell stories, but we're also there to help problem solve and also consult. So it's a pretty stressful space, but I think the diversity of what we do makes it really interesting.
When companies do come to you, or when, either in your role at Edelman or sort of outside that, and talk about putting together a PR or a communications plan, what do you think is the one area that companies usually overlook or often overlook, when they're going down this path?
I think the area they often most overlook is what's the story, which goes back to what we're fundamentally still doing is telling a story about an organization and what it stands for. So I always boil it back down to the core concept of the why, how, and what. And it just amazes me how many organizations don't have that why in their storytelling. And it's so important. We live in this world where misinformation is rife. People in general don't know what news sources to trust, so they'll go to social media 3 or 4 times, even though what's on social media is mostly garbage. And then they'll look at the traditional earned media and they'll listen to their employers. So telling a simple, effective, emotive story that truly connects to their audience is so important. So that's number one. The second thing that they need to be thinking about is, how do we earn trust? Trust is the currency that really helps ensure against crisis down the track and wins advocates, because, you know, this is fundamentally what companies are out there trying to achieve, is to convert people and win fans.
These are interesting points, because actually I come across something similar, which is the why that you talked about. Because sometimes there are companies or PR people who say, you know, let's put out a press release on this and get it out, or let's publish this article, or whatever it might be. But the question always is why are we doing that? What is the outcome that we're looking for? It's a cliche, but sort of, what does success look like? You know, what do we want out of this? And I think that's one area where it does seem to kind of fall down. We're not really in the business of just sending out press releases for the fun of it, or just for the record. It's for a purpose. It's to, you know, generate coverage or make a point or something along those lines. And I do think that's often forgotten.
Yeah, no, I agree. And what's interesting, though, Cam, is that you know, the press release, of course, was, or still is, for many organizations, a means of getting a missive out about the company. But many organizations these days, you know, they don't bother sending out press releases. Microsoft, for example, at a global level, posts on its blogs the most important announcements that you know, wants to get out there. And it has a legion of advocates who will follow, whether it's journalists, analysts, industry watchers, consumers, customers, you name it, who will pick up on this news and then share it. So really, it goes back to that notion of, what do we want to say, but how do we want to earn it?
You know, that when I worked at the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, and we did launch a chief executive blog when I was there, and you're right, like, publishing something in a blog or in an article on the website often does so much better than a press release. And it can be the same subject, the same key messages, but written in different ways. And one is so much more effective than the other. Yeah, that is something that's really come to light. But I think it's hard to get clients or companies to think that way, just because a press release has been around for so long. It's the first thing they think of often, yeah?
Right, absolutely. But, you know, if you're starting out there as an intrepid consultant, you've got to be thinking across multiple channels, because, as I mentioned, you know, audiences these days don't necessarily read newspapers, or they don't necessarily read CEO blogs, or they don't necessarily read LinkedIn forums. So you've got to take your mix. You've got to understand where your audience is at. And then really it is a conversation, and it's a conversation which is not meant to be too silly, but it's meant to be engaging and able to connect.
Right.
So it's a complex issue.
Yeah, I'm going to get out of the way so Ewan can ask a question here in a second. But the last one from me really is, we talk on this show a lot about advice for small businesses or for people in small companies, sort of how they can manage employment law and communications issues. So, I mean, what advice would you give to a small business that maybe doesn't have the resources to go out and hire you at Edelman or a full-time communications person in-house even? What should they be thinking about the most? What is their number one priority in your view?
Well, I think to start off with, what is it that they want to be talking about? You know, what is the story that they want to tell audience, and also who is the audience? Who are they trying to influence and engage? So that's really, really critical. I think, you know, you can get access to some pretty skilled and experienced consultants out there. Edelman's great. We do a lot of things really, really well, but there's also smaller firms out there who can equally offer some great advice and support. So have a look around. There are some good experts out there. I think also, you know, having that North Star of your why, what's the story that you want to tell, and also remembering that it's not a short-term exercise, it's a long-term goal, and the long-term goal should always be about earning trust among your key audience that you want to reach. It's all about advocacy that will help people actively recommend you, but also when times are down, actually actively defend you as well. So it's also about crisis mitigation. These are some of the things you need to think about. There's some short-term considerations, but also remember it's a long-term goal that essentially is all about earning trust capital.
Yeah, Simon, I just wanted to follow up on your last point. I mean, I deal with a lot of small and mid-sized employers. You know, we're talking 100 or a few hundred employees. And often I find that when we're trying to craft the policies, procedures, and workplace culture that an employer wants to present to the public to, largely to attract top talent or top clientele, the PR and communications element of disseminating that brand identity is really important. Unfortunately, I find that a lot of clients get really overwhelmed when they sit down with communications people, and they're introducing industry jargon and different tech products to help promote their brand. What strategies do you suggest to help engage employers and kind of get them on board?
You touched on an interesting conundrum which has existed for a long time, which is that marriage between legalese and PR. It can always be a slightly tricky one. But look, in terms of how you can position yourself as an employer of choice, there are many, many ways. You can join associations. You can look at employee engagement and actually use your own employees as advocates to take the brand out there and talk about why it's so special and such a great place to work. Another important aspect is what the company not only sells, but actually does from a societal or economic impact. So is there a CSR program, or better still, a really strong ESG that looks at areas like how the company operates around important issues such as the environment and sustainability, what are its policies on inclusion and so on. These are all issues that really matter to future employees, particularly younger generations. So it's important that you consider not only what the company is saying in terms of its product and sell and what it does, but actually what it stands for as well. And probably the last point I'd make is the importance of leadership. So, in this days of confusion and uncertainty, more and more people are looking to employers and business leaders for comment and opinion and direction on issues around the economy and society. So having a really strong leader who's out there and talking not just about the business, but how the business is participating, how it solves some of the societal and economic issues, that's really important as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the key elements of good corporate governance, and we've talked about this before on the show, is this idea of tone from the top. The idea that the CEO and the senior executives, they need to really set the tone for how the rest of the employees of the company should conduct themselves. Simon, how much involvement do you think that a communications team should have in that process, as opposed to just, letting the CEO or executives run loose and disseminate that message off the cuff, albeit in a more authentic way?
Well, authenticity, of course, is key, but there has to be a marriage between the two. And I think a great example of that, one that I always point to, is how Satya Nadella at Microsoft helped transform the image of the organization from the bad boy of software sales and monopoly in the 80s and 90s to the organization that it is today, which is really one that's out there, to solve and help the world through technology. But clearly, I don't know if you've read his biography, but the ethics of the man sit very closely at the heart of Microsoft's purpose these days. And I think that direction definitely comes from the top. But is he a communicator? No, not necessarily. He's working with teams around him, and not just communications teams, of course, but marketing and legal, of course. It's all important. So the direction should come from the top. Certainly, the values should be deep-seated across the leadership spectrum, and thereafter, it should really be a partnership. A happy partnership between those various teams.
I think, the part about the story is really important because that kind of sits at the heart of what you're trying to say. In the case of, for instance, again, when I was at the stock exchange, we really wanted to show that we were, innovative, forward thinking, there's a very successful financial market, that we're on par with the other large exchanges in the world. And these key themes kind of, you weave them into sort of every bit of communication that you have. Again, if you're a technology company, maybe that's innovation, and you try and work innovation into your announcements or your marketing materials or your communications materials to really try and drive home that key message or that key sort of image that you'd like to cultivate.
Yeah, quite right. So I've mentioned values, but of course, at the end of the day, we are telling a story through various channels and to various stakeholders. But there has to be consistency there. So underlying that should, of course, be your values, and then your North Star, which is the why, sits on top. But Cam, as you mentioned, those messages are really important. Typically, we recommend 2 or 3, but they should be repeated ad nauseum, so people really get to understand what it is you stand for, what you're trying to say. But yeah, consistency around messages really important.
Right on. Thank you so much for joining us today, Simon. We really appreciate it.
My absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, guys.
Show your support to the PR and Law podcast by making a one-time donation or setting up a subscription with us on Patreon. Every little bit helps us keep the lights on and bring the show to you each week. If you'd like to chip in, please visit prandlawpodcast.com. That's prandlawpodcast.com. Click support the show. Thanks for helping us out.
That was excellent having Simon on just now. I think, it's good to get that kind of perspective, right? Like, he's not an in-house guy. He's dealing with a lot of different clients. And so he brings that perspective to the way he looks at communications.
Oh, I'll say, yeah, that was really, really fantastic. I mean, I wish I sort of had better access to someone like that with a number of my clients, because, again, and this is why our show exists, right, Cam? We're just talking about the marriage between what you do and what I do. The idea that there is this wedding of PR and communications and employment law for employers, for employees, and you really need one just as much as you need the other. And I think there are so many small and mid-size employers out there that effectively turn a blind eye to what you guys do and the expertise that you offer, right? They sort of think, well, I've built a website and that's good enough and I'm up and running. But really, that's just tip of the iceberg kind of stuff.
So, Ewan, what have you got on tap this week?
Well, Cam, and I understand this might be beating a dead horse a little bit at this point, but I wanted to go back to Jeffrey Toobin. I know we talked about him in episode 29, and we were sort of speculating as to what might happen. If there are any listeners who are at this point unfamiliar with the story, and I don't really know how that's possible given all the media coverage that this has received, but Jeffrey Toobin, he wrote for the New Yorker. He also was a legal analyst for CNN, or still is, as I understand, a legal analyst for CNN. And a few weeks ago, he was caught masturbating during a Zoom call with a number of his colleagues. He was immediately suspended from the New Yorker. And the New Yorker promised to investigate the incident. Well, we learned of the conclusion of that investigation earlier this week, and Jeffrey Toobin was fired from the New Yorker. Right.
And one thing I didn't hear was what happened at CNN. Have they also let him go, or do you know? I should probably know that.
Well, good question. So I was hunting around the interwebs earlier today, trying to see if I could get anything conclusive on that. My understanding is CNN has yet to issue a statement as to whether or not he will remain at CNN. They seem to be quiet. I wouldn't be surprised if they were waiting to see how the New Yorker played this out, and perhaps the idea was to follow their steps. I don't know if you saw the statement, Cam, from Condé Nast's chief people officer, which I can only assume is some fancy name for head of HR. Yes. And just as an aside, I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but as an employment lawyer, this is precisely the kind of stuff that drives me nuts when you're sort of going through corporate policies and procedures manuals, and companies are creating unnecessarily difficult and convoluted terms for positions or things that can really be simplified to make them easier to understand. Anyway, putting that aside, so Stan Duncan, who is their chief people officer, he circulated a memo to the employees, and this is what it said. And I was curious to get your take on this too, Cam. So the memo said, "I'm writing to share with you that our investigation regarding Jeffrey Toobin is complete, and as a result, he is no longer affiliated with our company. I want to assure everyone that we take workplace matters seriously. We are committed to fostering an environment where everyone feels respected and upholds our standards of conduct." What do you think, Cam?
So I have not seen this before, so that's the first time I've heard it. I think at first listen, it sounds okay. The only part in there that I personally don't like is the bit about fostering. What does it say? A culture or a workplace or something? That sounds a little PR speaky to me. I think sometimes it's better just to come out and say, he's no longer affiliated with us. This kind of behavior will not be tolerated, and, you know, kind of be a little more direct. But I think it's not awful. Let's put it that way. It's passable. It's satisfactory.
Wow. Well, I think actually this might be, we should make a note. What's the date today? November 15th. You and I agree. From the PR and the legal angle, I agree with you. I think it probably should have been a little more, I don't know, curt is the wrong word, but perhaps a little more.
It looks overly processed. You know, it looks like someone's gone over it again and again and again and again. And I think the lesson in here, though, I think is when something negative happens, and obviously what Toobin did was a blight on the New Yorker. I mean, we talked about that. Not the New Yorker's fault, obviously, and I don't think anyone's going to cancel their subscription because of what Jeffrey Toobin did. But it associates them with Toobin's act, as you mentioned on episode 29. But I think for companies, you don't want to take a negative situation and then your reaction to that negative situation to then talk about how good you are, because that seems a little disingenuous. It's okay to put out positive messages about sort of the workplace culture that you're trying to build, but I would try and keep that separate from this kind of a statement, because it's not a pleasant thing. I mean, Jeffrey Toobin, by all accounts, is a well-liked guy at the New Yorker and at CNN. He's been around a very long time. It's not like, I mean, this was a huge surprise, but he is well-known himself. And I think it's okay just to say, this happened and he's now gone, and this is something we won't tolerate, and leave it at that. The fluffy stuff can come later.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, actually. And I mean, particularly considering that this was sort of an internal memo, right? I think all the more reason to just use fewer words, right? And that old adage of the writing style, if anybody takes the time to look up The Economist's writing guide, and it has sort of I think it's the 5 rules that George Orwell had for writing. And one of them is always use fewer words. If you can write a sentence using fewer words, do so.
Yes.
Always.
Yeah. This comes up a lot.
I think that's a rule that more people should follow, be it in law, PR, communications, whatever you do. I think that should be up there among the holy grail of writing tools.
I do have a question for you on this, though, Ewan. Normally, HR issues would be kept private. Like if somebody else got fired for, stealing the stapler or something, you wouldn't send out a company-wide memo about that. So at what point, and obviously Jeffrey Toobin, this became a public story, and I assumed that that's the difference. But at the same time, what sort of privacy is Toobin entitled to in this case? Because it's very strange to send an email across the company because someone has been fired. That seems quite odd to me, but what's your take?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Now, I came across this. This was according to a report in the Daily Beast, and it simply said they circulated a memo to employees. Whether it went to all employees, I don't know. It's difficult to know who it was circulated to specifically. But I think given, just sort of the scope of what had happened and the press that it received, that frankly, it provided an opportunity for the company to sort of stake its position in terms of these issues. And I think that that's also important, Cam, because, this issue was it was kind of a novel thing, right? Because it was specific to Zoom, which is a relatively new technological tool, at least for most people in a professional context. So I think it was an opportunity to sort of, for Condé Nast, which is a large, huge company, to sort of state, look, we're drawing a line here. And we all know that, the conduct that Toobin engaged specifically is grossly inappropriate in any context. We know this, but it also sort of states that, anything that you might think is borderline inappropriate in a boardroom, for example, it is also inappropriate in a Zoom context. So I think they did sort of have to come out in a sort of a forceful fashion and state that position, that we're not going to condone this type of behavior.
Yeah. Also, on the PR side here, it is normal for companies to not comment on something like this publicly because it is a personnel or an HR issue. And a lot of companies will have this in their communications handbook and say it is a policy of the company not to comment on personnel issues at all. And I think that's generally good, because it sets the expectation up front. In fact, at every company I've worked at or dealt with, they've had a similar policy. But like you say, Ewan, in this case, it became a news story. And I don't know, it does take some consideration about where on that spectrum does it trigger, a public statement or a public comment, because if it's the receptionist or the janitor who got let go, if it's somebody else who's less in the public eye, you obviously wouldn't say something publicly. And obviously Jeffrey Toobin is very much in the public eye, so you do say something. But where's the line between the two? That's really difficult to say. But I think it should lean more towards not speaking publicly about PR or HR issues.
Yeah, obviously trying to figure out where that line is always going to be tricky. And again, it's probably going to involve some difficult conversations between people like you and people like me. The other thing that I wanted to touch on here, Cam, was the timeline, because there was a lot of press that was very, very critical of the New Yorker and Condé Nast for taking so long to terminate Toobin. So we're talking about a timeline of just over 3 weeks between the date, that the incident occurred and the date that his termination was announced. In particular, I came across what I thought was a rather silly New York Post article that, took the position that Toobin should have been terminated almost immediately, sort of given the clear video evidence that they were dealing with. And my take on this, Cam, I think that position is kind of silly. I think, and I understand there's going to be those that would disagree with me on this, and I'm, sort of happy to discuss their comments in future episodes. But, I think Condé Nast actually did the right thing here. And I think they did what more businesses need to do in the age of cancel culture. And that's to sort of trust the policy and procedures that they've built as a company and stick to them. And not just stick to them, but stick to them for the low profile cases, and even more so for the high profile cases. And if you don't have those clear policies and procedures in place in terms of what's appropriate conduct for employees and what isn't, then create them, circulate them to staff, include them with employment agreements during the hiring process. There needs to be transparency as a company and transparency for employees to ensure that, there's consistency in the way that these disciplinary measures are implemented. But I think what the media sort of failed to understand here is that when you want to do that properly and you want to carry out a proper and professional investigation that ensures things like procedural fairness and, ensuring there's no apprehension of bias, that takes time. Even when you might have, clear video evidence, the investigator still needs to review the company's policies and procedures. It needs to consider any relevant laws or statutes that might be at play. It needs to interview any of the relevant witnesses, interview the complainant, interview the respondent. All of these things take time, Cam. Mm-hmm. And, we've talked about this before, that often people are out for blood right away. But I think, companies walk a very, very fine line there in terms of sort of jumping the gun with a knee-jerk reaction and then taking too long. But I think if you want to show that you're a highbrow professional operation, you need to take the time and conduct a thorough and proper investigation, regardless of how clear-cut the evidence may seem to be.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that point. And I think, no matter what the New Yorker did or Condé Nast did, they were going to be criticized by somebody or by some news organization, because if they would have moved quickly, somebody would have said that they didn't, give Toobin enough time, or it was too knee jerk, like you just mentioned. And I do think there are times where the quick dismissal happens, and we've talked about it on this show in the case of sort of the racist woman in Central Park who was harassing a bird watcher. I mean, in that case, she worked for, I believe it was a broker, an investment bank. And they let her go right away. But in that case, they saw immediate threat to the business if they didn't, because people were already talking about pulling money and assets out of that account. So that's a little different. The New Yorker wasn't under the same kind of pressure. I think if they were, they may have acted faster. So it's not really a one size fits all, but in general, I completely agree. Take the time necessary to review it thoroughly, talk to the people involved, and make sure that when the decision is made, it's defendable in case somebody comes after the company afterwards.
Wait a minute.
Check this out.
Whoa, hey, check this out. No, wait. Check it out.
I want you to check this out.
On the PR and Law podcast.
All right, Ewan, two things I wanted to mention today. One is the Ezra Klein Show podcast again. I think this is the third week in a row that I've mentioned it. But there's a new episode out basically that looks at what's happening with the challenge to the election results. And, he has a guest on who is quite versed in sort of democracies that sort of end up going a bit sideways. And it's not about Trump. And Ezra Klein says this repeatedly, that he finds Trump rather kind of uninteresting. But what he's interested in is the fact that the GOP seems to be falling in line behind this challenge to some degree. And how quickly the party fell to Trump in general, going back to 2015, 2016, and what that sort of portends for the future. And it is a kind of an uneasy discussion to listen to, but I think it's definitely worthwhile. And then the second thing, quickly, Ewan, is I don't know if you've heard of Parler. This is a conservative version of Twitter. It's actually been around since 2018, and they promise that they're going to be, they're not going to moderate the content in any way. And so it's meant to be a sort of a free speech social network, which has kind of then been hijacked by the right. And I logged into it this week, and it's it's very interesting because you sign in and then it asks, would you like to follow these people? And it presents like a who's who list from the right of, Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson and people along those lines. It's quite, anyway, this service has kind of taken off. They've surpassed the 1 million users mark, which is very low compared to other social networks, but it's also double what it was a few weeks ago. So it's definitely got some momentum. So there's an article on Parler that in the Wall Street Journal that I'll post to as well.
Yeah, Caitlin Flanagan from The Atlantic, Cam, I don't know if you saw this. She was on Bill Maher this week, and the issue of Parler came up, and she made a really good point, or what I thought was a really good point anyway, talking about how, we've got to get the two sides in the United States back to the table together. And the media has to do a better job as well. And, Flanagan was sort of making the argument that on election night, the vast majority of coverage, it was like, in those early hours when it looked like Trump was going to win, we're basically in tears across the network. Yes. And we're looking for anything that might be indicative of, indicative of pro-Biden results. And Flanagan was saying, what do you expect? You've got a substantial portion of the population. I mean, more, as we know, was 71 million voters that voted for Trump, approximately, I think. This isn't like a drop in the bucket. And you can understand why these individuals might be incredibly frustrated with mainstream media. And the reality is that if, we don't create a means for everybody to play nice together, then what's going to happen is we're going to have Parler, right? If Twitter gets to a place where, no, we're not going to permit certain conservative voices that we deem to be inappropriate or unacceptable, they're just going to go elsewhere. They're not going to go away. And I thought that Flanagan really sort of hit the nail on the head there, that it's not about whether or not you agree or disagree. It's about the fact that they're all Americans and they have to come together and try and find some meeting of the minds.
Yeah. And we talked about this on a previous show about the media and how partisan it seems to have become. I'm definitely on board with everything you just said. And I did see Flanagan on Bill Maher. I'll link to that as well in the show notes to take a look. But it's bad. I mean, I look at it and I go, if I'm a conservative, if I really feel strongly about President Trump and I support him, you don't see your views reflected anywhere in the mainstream media. It's not like, just Fox News and then the other organizations that are even further sort of on the right. You have to go there. And those are by nature much smaller. In the mainstream, there's just nothing. And this is why I do hold the big news organizations in the US partly responsible for Donald Trump being elected in the first place. And it looks like nothing has been learned. Absolutely nothing has been learned. And Flanagan's right in the sense that Trump supporters aren't going anywhere. Biden will take the White House and they're still going to be there. And it's going to be an issue for years to come unless there's some effort made to resolve it. But I think it's going to be extremely difficult. I'm not holding my breath.
Well, fair enough. I wanted to talk, Cam, about, and this isn't a particular article, there are lots of articles, but just the news story in general of Kim Ng, who was named the general manager of Major League Baseball's Miami Marlins earlier this week, making her the first woman to hold a GM position in the 4 major North American professional sports leagues. That's huge news, or I feel like it should be bigger news than what it is. Lots of great stuff written about this. And then unfortunately, some not so great stuff written about this. But for those who aren't familiar with her, and frankly, I wasn't, Cam.
I was not either.
I have to admit, she got started with the Chicago White Sox all the way back in 1990. So she's been around for a very, very long time. She worked for the organization until 96. And then in 98, she joined the Yankees and was there during, their World Series runs. She then moved on to the Dodgers from 2002 to 2011 and was in the commissioner's office, the MLB commissioner's office from 2011 until 2020. So, she's been in the game for a very, very, very long time and has been incredibly successful. And I found this story sort of just really grabbed my interest. And I was reading all kinds of news reports from different sources and on Twitter, and was really kind of disappointed once again, with just sort of the inherent sexism, misogyny that continues to permeate the sports world.
This is the most conservative.
Just stupid comments. A lot of men, saying she should stay in her lane. They chalked up the decision to, liberal pandering and gender quotas. Just really, really, really ignorant stuff, particularly given just how long Kim Ng has been kicking ass in professional sports by the sounds of it.
Yeah, that is an interesting story, and I did hear that just recently. I think sports. We've talked about sports here too. It's very conservative. They've got an image issue. I think females are now more common on sports broadcasts in Canada and the US, but even that came very late. And then you talk about just being conservative. The Columbus Blue Jackets in the NHL hired a Finnish general manager several years ago. And that was big news because it was the first time someone was hired from overseas. So, even before we get to sort of females in these roles, right now they're kind of picking executives from the same small pool of, North American sportsmen. And so there's a long way to go here. And I do think that this is important. I think she's a role model, for other females, and it's going to make the next team to do it probably more calm or more less anxious about hiring a female, because the first one has now been hired. And so now it's hopefully not as big of a deal going forward.
Well, yeah. And here's the thing, like, this is one of those double-edged swords, right? Where, yes, this should be a big deal. And then at the same time, it really, really shouldn't be a big deal, because she got the job because she was the best qualified person, removing gender pronouns. She was the most qualified person for the job. And I think we have to try and get to that place where, we're not just focusing on the fact that, yes, she's a woman, she's a visible minority. How about the fact that she was the best qualified individual for the role, and that's why she was given the role? And this idea that it was liberal pandering or she was there for gender quotas. No, she was there because she's the best person for the job. And having now done some background on who she was, that certainly seems to be the case.
Yeah, I agree totally. Anything else you want to add, Ewan, before we wrap this one up?
No, that's it. That was a lot of fun. And again, just so great having Simon on the show. We have these wonderful guests, and I always sort of wish I could just have them on speed dial to get advice when I need it. What? Fantastic.
I do have Simon on speed dial, and I do call him frequently, actually. So I work with him fairly closely. All
right, well, I'll call you and you can call Simon. We can figure it out that way.
Yeah, he was absolutely great. Thanks again, Simon Murphy from Edelman, joining us today. It was a good show. We discussed all kinds of interesting topics today. So don't miss any future episode either. We hope they're as good as this one. You can subscribe in your podcast app of choice or to our YouTube and SoundCloud channels. And you can follow us on social media as well: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And our newsletter, very proud of our newsletter. You can sign up for that at prlawpodcast.club to get notification when new episodes drop and other news about the show. So once again, for you and Christy, this is Cam McMurtry. Light it up.
This has been the PR and Law Podcast with Cam McMurtry and Ewan Christie. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with a friend or leave a review. You can also join us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook by following our account at PR Law Podcast. That's all one word, PRLAW Podcast. Thanks for your support.